But I wanted to welcome you all to Multiple Displacements, Neoliberalism and Gentrification in Chinatown, China, and Beyond. So this is part one of a two-part Organizing Asian Communities track that's organized by CAV, Organizing Asian Communities. So I'm Laurel. I'm a longtime organizer with CAV and a PhD student in geography at CUNY Graduate Center. Helena will be discussing CAV and the work that we do. But I just wanted to give a little bit of context about how we what inspired us to organize this session. So our primary goal is to build power in working class Asian communities, and political education is a component of that. So in the spirit of political education, Helena convened politicking study groups in the start of 2011. And originally our study focus was on white supremacy. So we're trying to understand white supremacy from an Asian-centered perspective. We talked about the typical things that you would discuss in an Asian American Studies class. Like I've taught Asian American Studies, so model minority myth, we spent some time discussing Black on Asian hate crimes and how that's used to reinforce anti-Black racism and the model minority myth without really looking at the systems and the white power structures. And then, of course, has anyone here heard of that Chinese professor YouTube clip where there's a Chinese professor sitting in front of the room and then a bunch of Chinese students and they're all laughing together about how China owns U.S. debt? How China owns U.S. debt. Oh. You've all heard of that? Yes. Okay, so if you haven't heard of it, just type in Chinese professor at youtube.com and you'll come up with it. So it's basically trying to scare, it's about austerity, promoting fiscal austerity, the U.S. federal government shouldn't be spending money because China owns our debt and then it's giving them power over us. Basically, it's like this conservative argument, but also very racist. This clip brought us to a standstill, and we realized to understand what's happening in the U.S. today, we also really need to understand what's happening in China. So that's where our thinking started heading. In any mainstream newspaper, you'll see China portrayed as this gigantic villainous threat to U.S. economic hegemony, and then Chinese people as this personification of that threat. And then, as we know, racist America doesn't distinguish Asians from each other. All Asians are automatically Chinese and lumped into this threat. So Stuart Hall talks about how race is the arena where social anxieties and fears are projected and worked through. And this, I just finished reading Policing the Crisis, so if you're all interested in that argument, I encourage you to look at that book. But race is also a wedge that will divide the working class. So our study group maintained this race question, but expanded to incorporate China into our analysis. And then Helena came up with the idea of this panel because we wanted to sharpen our analysis about China and think about how to translate that analysis into our organizing work in Chinatown. So really briefly, some framing questions for this panel. When we say gentrification, what do we mean? So how can gentrification be articulated as one component of a broad set of neoliberal global processes? More specifically, how can gentrification and displacement in Chinatown of New York City be understood in relation to land grabs, privatization, and demolitions occurring all over China? So just the connection between Chinatown and China. And then what are the different iterations of neoliberalism operating in the U.S. and in China? How are they parallel and connected, and then how are they different? So Harvey writes about neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics and a brief history of neoliberalism. So how does this help, this analysis help us understand neoliberalism as a global process? And then the fourth question is, how does the development of an analysis of the conditions of China inform understanding of racism in the U.S. and in the world? So a global analysis of racism. So I'm going to really briefly lay out the definition of neoliberalism, which actually Ellen lays out in a 2009 Working USA article. So it's the elimination of trade barriers between countries, the retreat of the state from social services and provisions. So we see this in the U.S. through the erosion of the New Deal, and then in China through the breaking of the Iron Rights Pool. We see increasing polarization of wealth, declining power of workers, and then I'm going to add one more to this definition. It's the increase of authoritarian state power. So in New York City, we see it through policing. In the U.S., we see it through militarization, and there's also kind of a police state operating in China as well. And the military there is growing. So let's get started with our panelists. I guess after I introduce everyone, you can come speak standing here. And then I'm going to do some moderated Q&A. I'll be asking some questions, and then we'll take questions from all of you. So Helena is speaking first. She's going to take Esther's place today, and she's going to speak about CAB. Helena has been organizing with CAB for about 17 years. Right. So now you know how old she is, right? And she founded CAB's Chinatown Tenant Union. She became CAB's executive director in 2010.
Okay. So it's really exciting to see everybody here today. Really quickly, CAB is an organization that's 26 years old, based in New York City. We started off as an organization in 1986, really coming out of a lot of doing education and advocacy around hate crimes against Asians in the U.S. And as the Asian population began to change, and people come in the 90s when immigration opened up, and it was more people who were of a lower class, people who were tracked into low-wage jobs and into some of the worst neighborhoods, as well as refugees of war coming into the United States. We began to look at more community-based organizing, and not just at kind of the physical violence of Asians, but what are some of the systemic and institutional ways that people are violated every single day. And so then in the last 15 years or so, something like that, there's been a lot of our work has been really kind of based in communities. So we work in the Southeast Asian community in the Bronx. We organize tenants in Chinatown, and we also did worker issues. So we helped form Domestic Workers United, which is now an independent organization. And so a lot of our thinking around our work is around, as Laurel said, kind of what are the institutional and systemic and root causes of racism and of violence, right? And we're very clear in our work of having we're really clear that unlike other organizations that provide services or that do advocacy work, that we have to organize in order to build power in the United States. And what we mean by building power is that people who are most affected by issues that impact them need to be the ones that are standing up and that are fighting on their own behalf. And so a lot of what we do, generally people come to us because they're facing some sort of issue, and then we'll move them so that they will fight around other issues. For example, if somebody comes to us because they have a tenant issue, then we'll generally move them to go and support other organizations' actions, whether they're a homeless organization or a queer organization. We do a lot of leadership development of our members in order for there to be consciousness around race, class, gender, and then we move people to be able to fight for themselves and fight on a broader social justice platform, right? So how long do I have to talk? Was that it? Was that just the intro to CAB?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can talk more.
Oh.
You have more
Yeah.
time?
How much time do I have?
Like 7 more minutes.
Oh, so I can talk about our work.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Cool. Sorry. So I'll get into the Chinatown work a little bit more because that's kind of what this panel is about. In Chinatown, and actually start off with, in Chinatown, what we see a lot of people come to us because they're being displaced by their landlords. So there are a lot of housing issues. Chinatown has some of the oldest housing in the city, but it's also some of the last rent-regulated housing left in Manhattan. So outside of Washington Heights, Manhattan Chinatown really has kind of the last bastion of affordable housing. And the affordable housing that exists in New York, there isn't any new ones that are being built, but they were fought for by social justice movement in the 30s, 40s that were trying to protect New York City from being a city that was just for the elite, right? And so a lot of the affordable housing that exists now are a legacy of the struggles from before. So as New York City becomes more and more of a global center of capital, and there's more, it's more attractive for young people, for students, for people who work in the finance industry to live in New York City. Everybody wants to live in Manhattan, right? And everybody wants to be near Wall Street, and everybody wants to be near all the subway lines. And so Chinatown in the last 15 years has seen a lot of displacement and a lot of people being pushed out. And the way that the laws work are that if you are a lot of the times the tenants get kicked out because they're non-primary residents. So basically that the landlord will argue that they don't necessarily live in New York, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then also that people are illegally subletting to other folks. So if you look at the population that lives in Manhattan, Chinatown, most of the folks have been here for about 15 years. Or so, and do work in the low-wage industry. So before there was the garment industry, but since 9/11, the garment industry has gone, and people work in construction, they work in home health care, and they also work out of state in a lot of the takeout restaurants that exist kind of all over the U.S. now. And so a lot of times people don't live in New York full-time. They work elsewhere in order to survive and support their families here in New York City. And so in a lot of ways, because of the economic realities of the community, the law is set in a way where then people are really screwed, because the primary residence of the person who's making money is in New York, and they would consider New York their home, but they're actually working elsewhere. And so their family members are screwed when they are out living elsewhere. Right. Get what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. The other issue is that rents in New York City are just high. I mean, who here lives in New York? And how many of you pay more than $1,000 in rent?
More than what?
1,000. Like your apartment is more than 1,000.
Unit or?
Huh? Yeah. Well, okay, it's fine. Regardless, I think a lot of people here, I would imagine, are living in situations where you have roommates, right? Or you know, there's no way that you can.
We each have our own struggle, fight for our apartment if it's a cheap apartment.
Yeah, that's right. Or if you're in a rent-regulated apartment, you're like dying to stay there, which I totally get. So in the reality of people's wages in Chinatown are that they're so low that you have to double up, triple up families in apartments in order for people to afford the rents. And so a lot of times you have one family living in one bedroom, right? Instead of like one person per room. And so and there's a lot of there's pretty severe overcrowding in Chinatown, and it's the reality that people are trying to stay in the community, they work in the community, and there's really no place else that they can live that they can afford. And so a lot of times the landlords are also trying to kick out their tenants because of something called illegal subletting, right? That they're renting it out to other people who don't necessarily, or there's too many people there in the apartments. So people come to us when they're already in a situation where it's pretty desperate, because there's really kind of no other choice that they have. They're about to get taken to court, and then we actually generally refer them to UJC. But before we do that, we're really clear that what the issue that's happening is not just about their own individual apartment or their own individual issue, but that this is something that's happening community-wide. And so when we first started doing gentrification work in the 90s, in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was most people, actually nobody used the word gentrification in Chinatown, but now everybody understands what the issue is, and that's a result of us taking people's individual problems and organizing and really talking about the issue in a broader historical, political, socio-economic context, right? So, how much more time do I have?
4 more minutes.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, so that's one area that we've seen how the policies of housing policies can really kind of screw poor people who are really the people who make up the service economy of Chinatown. So that's one area, right? And when we say gentrification, we really mean that that the people who are being displaced are low-income, poor people of color generally, and the people who are coming in are usually younger, more mobile, more upward class, and white, right, coming into the community. So in the last 10 years, Chinatown has lost 14% of its Asian immigrant population, and that's according to the census. And they're being pushed into tighter conditions, but they're also being pushed out to the outer boroughs. The other way that we've seen gentrification happening is through public space and the way that space is used. And so in the late 90s, actually in the mid 90s, when Giuliani was still around, there was a big push to kind of clean up the streets of New York. And through his quality of life campaign, Giuliani really, what he did was he criminalized everything, right? So street vending, for example, was criminalized. And so we would have vendors who would get 4 or 5 tickets a day for like $500 each, and then they would have to go and defend themselves in administrative court. And what we saw was that as Giuliani was cleaning up the streets, new people were also coming into the community, and there was a lot of the different kind of the different things were kind of exploding in our faces in a lot of ways, right? And so a lot of times when people think about gentrification, they say that, you know, it's actually helpful for a community because you have a community that's economically depressed, that's poor, and if you make it better, if you improve it, then isn't that great for everybody? And what we see is that generally when people talk about bettering a community, what it means is that it's better for another set of people, that the policies and the changes that happen are things like garbage being picked up more, right? Local business owners being told that they have to sweep more, and so there's more enforcement on the ground. But then there's also changes in policy around how subsidies are given to developers and what kind of developments can happen in a space. And a lot of times those subsidies also come attached with the public space. So free public space given to developers to then use how they want, as long as it serves to improve the community, right? And then also there's more policing, and there's more people who are criminalized. So loitering, right? People who are just standing around, young people, old people. We have tenants who hang out in the parks because their apartments are overcrowded, and they stay in the park after dusk, and then they get ticketed, but they don't know that the parks close at dusk, right? So things like that happen all the time when a community is getting better. So I think I'll stop there for now.
Great, thanks.